Yo, what is up guys? Delboy here, aka Blue Collar Sports TV. Hopefully you guys are doing well. If you're new here, smash that like, hit subscribe, all of that good stuff. So this is a quick preview and prediction for Errol Spence Jr. versus Danny Garcia. The fight of course goes down on December the 5th. Both of the WBC and the IBF welterweight titles will be on the line. Of course they are currently held by Errol Spence Jr. I actually believe Danny Garcia is the WBC mandatory. So yeah, this is a pretty interesting fight in my opinion. Even when this fight was first talked about before Errol Spence Jr. had his car crash, I still didn't mind the fight then, to be honest. But I do have to admit, the fact that Errol Spence has gone what he's gone through, I think it makes this fight a lot more interesting, because ultimately if Errol Spence Jr. is suffering any ill effects from that car crash still, then Danny Garcia could be a step too far. But we'll get into that a little bit later. Let's get onto the tail of the tapes briefly. We're going to start with Errol Spence Jr. Errol Spence has a perfect record of 26-0, 21 of his 26 wins coming by way of knockout. Danny Garcia has a record of 36 wins and 2 defeats, 21 of his 36 wins coming by way of knockout. Errol Spence Jr. he is listed as 5'9.5" with a 72-inch reach, whereas Danny Garcia is listed as 5'8" with a 68.5-inch reach. So Errol Spence Jr. has a 1.5-inch height advantage and a 3.5-inch reach advantage. Errol Spence Jr. of course is a southpaw. Danny Garcia is an orthodox fighter. Errol Spence Jr. is 30 years old, whereas Danny Garcia is 32 years old. So now the tail of the tape is out of the way, let's get into it. Before we start the actual, styles clash type of thing, obviously the intangible surrounding this fight is the car crash of Errol Spence Jr. Will that have any effects on him during this fight? Now you would imagine, we are here surmising, but for people around Errol Spence Jr., if they felt he was depleted or not the same, then I can't imagine that they would have put him in there with Danny Garcia. Danny Garcia would have been far too dangerous. So maybe they're seeing things that we're not. Maybe Errol Spence Jr. is completely fine. However, I do still think it's something that you need to consider when talking about this fight. I mean, of course, Errol Spence Jr., he had his car accident, I think it was last October, and obviously he was out of the ring for a significant period of time, as we know, not just in terms of pro fights, but in terms of sparring. Errol Spence Jr. only returned to full contact sparring in the fall of this year. So he was out of the ring in total for the best part of a year. That's no fights, no sparring for the best part of a year. Now obviously you need regular fights, you need regular sparring to stay sharp and get better. But also, regular fights, regular sparring, it conditions the body in order to take punishment and punches. When you've not done that for a while, is your durability going to be the same? In a relatively short amount of time, can Errol Spence Jr. build his body back up to where it once was? When you're a professional fighter, your body does become used to taking punches and punishments. When it's not done that for a while, the body theoretically is going to respond a lot differently to the same punches that he was taking a lot easier when he was more active. So yeah, Errol Spence's inactivity and his lack of sparring more so is a bit concerning going into this fight. Hopefully it doesn't affect him though, but that is something in my opinion that you need to consider. In regards to the style clash, as we mentioned in the tail of the tape, Errol Spence is a taller and longer fighter, and I believe that's going to play a factor in this fight. I don't expect to see an aggressive Errol Spence Jr. I don't expect to see Errol Spence Jr. meet fire with fire like he did with Sean Porter. I know Sean Porter's a much different fighter to Danny Garcia. Sean Porter kind of makes you fight that fight, and Errol Spence Jr. was keen to engage him in that. I don't think Errol Spence Jr. is going to initiate the pressure game in this fight. I don't think he's going to take that risk. Danny Garcia he's a very astute counterpuncher with power. He's got great timing, he's got great eyes, and he's got great poise when he's throwing with you. He's very dangerous if you exchange with him. We saw that in the Amir Khan fight. So, given what's gone on with Errol Spence Jr., I'm sure, despite what he says, despite what his team says, there must be some sort of doubts in the back of his mind after what's gone on in the past 12 months. So I would expect Errol Spence Jr. to basically get back to the basics, box out of that southpaw stance, be consistent with the jab and the long straight punches. I could see Errol Spence Jr. boxing this fight kind of similar to how he boxed Mikey Garcia, but a little less aggressive, you know? I really think Errol Spence Jr. is going to pick his moments in this fight, when to attack, when to put on pressure, and when to just box behind the jab. And I think that's definitely going to be the smart thing going into this fight, not only because Danny Garcia is a dangerous counterpuncher when you engage him, but, you know, Errol Spence Jr. in the back of his mind, he must be still thinking about what happened back in last October. So I want to see Errol Spence Jr., you know, box in this fight. I think that's his best strategy, to be honest. Avoid the power as much as possible, because Danny can whack a bit of 147. And who knows, maybe Errol Spence's chin isn't the same as it once was. So why take the chance? Just box behind the jab. I actually believe Errol Spence Jr.'s technical skills are good enough in which he can outbox Danny Garcia. Errol Spence Jr., of course, is a brilliant inside fighter. He's great at mid-range as well. But I also believe Errol Spence Jr. is perfectly capable of boxing on the outside. Yeah, it's not his strong point, but he still does it to a fairly good level. And in my opinion, I think he does it well enough to actually outbox Danny Garcia on the outside. Errol Spence Jr. has actually got really good lead hand control. He's got a brilliant jab, and he can certainly box across all ranges. So I expect Errol Spence Jr. To box a lot more in this fight, be a little bit more passive and safety first. That's what I'm expecting. Kind of cover up when Danny gets close, work when you have to, etc, etc. And ultimately, that's the advice I would give to Errol Spence Jr. That's the fight I think he should fight. Obviously, from an entertainment perspective, I'd love to see Errol Spence Jr. go in there and force the fight, because obviously Danny Garcia is a counterpuncher and he wants guys to come onto him in order to get his work done. So I would rather see that, but from a technical point of view, I think it would be better for Errol Spence Jr. to box in this one, utilise that southpaw jab, the straight left hand, and his solid boxing ability. So I think Errol Spence Jr. needs to box a little bit more in this fight. Having said that, maybe he does the opposite. Maybe he actually fights this fight in an aggressive manner. And I'm not saying he can't win the fight that way. I certainly think he can. He's got enough punch output. You know, Danny Garcia is not an output puncher. If Errol Spence Jr. is active and aggressive, he can certainly outwork Danny Garcia. But it just increases the risk that he walks into something big. I do believe he can win the fight by pressuring Danny. I just think it gives Danny a bit better chance to win, basically. But maybe he does that. Maybe he's hearing people like me, you know, question how good he is now after what happened. Maybe he's hearing people like me and the doubters, and he wants to shut us up. Maybe that's how he's going to approach this fight. If he does, it's going to make it a lot more entertaining, and it will answer a lot of questions. But yeah, I think Errol needs to box in this one. As for Danny Garcia, I mean, as we know, Danny Garcia is a counterpuncher, and He himself has actually got underrated boxing skills, in my opinion, but primarily he is a counterpuncher. In this fight, though, you know, I think the onus could be on him to actually force the initiative and maybe pressure the fight, to be honest. One of the problems with Danny Garcia historically is the fact that his punch output hasn't always been great. Several times you've seen Danny Garcia fight, you know, in a couple of his losses, like Sean Porter and Keith Thurman, you think to yourself, those fights were winnable if you applied a little more pressure. If you threw a few more punches, those fights were winnable. Danny Garcia has always had a low work rate, and he always looks like he leaves something in the ring. He can't do that against Errol Spence Jr. He needs to force the pace and have a higher punch output. He needs to draw Errol Spence Jr. into a fight. If he draws him into a fight, that's when he can use that timing, that left hook, or the overhand right, and that is especially effective against a southpaw like Errol Spence Jr. People always look out for Danny Garcia's left hook. I think it's his overhand right or his straight right that could be the key punch for him in this fight. Errol Spence Jr., of course, does get caught with that shot. We've seen it in numerous fights, namely the Kell Brook fight. So the straight right hand for Danny Garcia, that's certainly a punch he needs to be utilising in this fight. And yeah, ultimately, Danny Garcia needs to be Danny Garcia turned up a notch. That's what I'm trying to say. Greater punch output, quickening up the feet, cutting the ring off better. And if he does that, you know, maybe he's got a chance, but he certainly needs to adjust a lot in this fight. And one more thing, if I was if I was training Danny Garcia, you know, I'd be drilling it into him, you know, to basically try and catch Errol Spence Jr. with something big early on, you know, to really test that chin, to make Errol Spence Jr. feel something and put some doubt in his mind. Catch him with something big early on to really put him in his place. I think that's important for Danny Garcia in this fight. You can't afford to let Errol Spence Jr. get confidence after all of the time he's had out of the ring. I'm sure going into this fight there must be some anxiety there from Errol Spence Jr. And if I was Danny Garcia, I'd want to pile on that from round one, catch him with something big and plant those seeds of doubt. And yeah, Danny just needs to be Danny, but much more aggressive, basically. That's how I see it for Danny Garcia. He's not going to be boxing like Pernell Whitaker or Terence Crawford. He's not going to be moving and countering. No, he sets his feet in counters, but he needs to be a lot more aggressive in this fight. But yeah, ultimately, I actually do really like this fight. I think stylistically, it's an interesting fight. One thing about Errol Spence Jr., when he's aggressive, one thing I've always noticed is when you punch with him, you can catch him. Kell Brook showed that. Sean Porter showed that. Even in Errol Spence Jr.'s early fights against sort of fringe contenders and like gatekeepers, he was getting caught when people were trading with him. Errol Spence Jr. has good defense when he's concentrating on defense. He's got good offense when he's concentrating on offense, but he's not one of those fighters who merges the two together well, if that makes sense. When Errol Spence Jr. is defensive, he's defensive. When he's offensive, he's offensive. But he doesn't match the two together well. When he's offensive, you know, when he's letting go of shots, he is open and he's there to be hit. So, yeah, he needs to be wary of that going into this fight. Box behind the jab, keep that nice tight high guard that Errol Spence Jr. has, and minimise the risk of, you know, catching something in return. And yeah, work behind that jab, basically. But yeah, ultimately, my prediction for this fight would be Errol Spence Jr. on points. But there are doubts in my mind in regards to this one. I just can't count on the fact that Errol Spence Jr. is going to be the same guy. I'm hoping he is because he's my favourite welterweight. I think he's a brilliant fighter. But we're going to see what happens. We're going to see what happens. But my pick is Errol Spence Jr. on points. I think he's going to box a lot more than usual in this one. And yeah, interesting fight. Ironically enough, by the way, I actually recorded this video earlier and I got through the recording basically and my PC crashed without me saving the audio file. It's ironic, I do an Errol Spence Jr. prediction video and my PC crashes, much like the car, right? But yeah, this is second time around. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Share your predictions below. Who are you picking and how? Peace.